I'm getting ready to start assembling the box, and here's the dado that we made across where the base piece is coming in. The shallow dado is not really there for strength. The pocket screws give me lots of strength, but it does two things for me. It makes assembly so much faster because once I get in that groove, I don't have to worry about anything other than just driving my screws. And the second thing is, it's just always a cleaner looking joint no matter how good a job you do, cutting and everything. A butt joint is still always just going to be a butt joint. You know, if there's anything swelled up on the end of the piece of plywood or whatever, you're not going to get a clean joint. But once I've made that dado, man, it's going to give me a great joint every time, and the box is going to go together so much faster. So all I'm going to do is pull these pieces together. I like to go ahead and assemble it with what's going to be the face frame side up. It takes a little bit more doing because this plywood shelf is cut 3/8 of an inch narrower so that the plywood back can come behind it. But what I'll do is I'm just going to raise that up to where it's flush up there. And see, if you look down here, the back of my shelf lines up with that dado, so the plywood's just going to come right on behind it, and I'll staple it in there. That also adds a lot of strength to the cabinet. Now, I'm going to be using some 1-inch coarse thread screws to put the box together. And the screws also tend to push the plywood up. Some people get really hung up about making their dados exactly the thickness of the plywood. And, I mean, you can buy shims and all sorts of things if you were to use a dado head, but you know, for me, I'm not counting on that dado to give me strength. It's to give me a good joint. So I love the fact that these screws push the piece up to the top and make the joint really tight on the top. Okay. I'm just going to scoot this over. Repeat the process on the other side. Again, this is that side that's going to be our finished side, so I don't have anything there, just plywood. No holes of any kind. Now the next thing I'm going to need to do, once I've got this bottom in place, is I'm going to measure across here at the bottom and cut a stretcher rail to go across the top so that we'll have the same size opening the whole way. And I usually just make that out of some kind of a piece of scrap plywood that I've got left. On our bookcases up here where it's going to be open and be seen, I used a piece of solid lumber. But for down here, I just use some sort of a scrap of plywood that I've got left, you know, at least 2.5 inches wide. Now, here's where I want to install the stretcher rail. It needs to be pretty well flush with this rebate and flush with the top. I can just take this one clamp, clamp one side and get it to hold while I screw the other side. I can use 1 1/4 screw here because I don't have a dado for it to go into. Okay. Now this stretcher rail does two things for me. It gives me something to nail or staple my plywood back to, but also when I get ready to install the cabinet, it gives me a lot more meat to run screws through into the studs in the wall. Okay, the next step, I'm going to go cut a plywood back. Again, it's just 1/4 inch plywood. And I don't usually run mine all the way to the floor. I'm just going to run it to the bottom of this. And up here, I'm actually probably going to make it a little bit short because it doesn't matter if it's a little bit short, if it's a little bit long, it's kind of a pain. So 29.5 by 31 3/4. Okay, my plywood back fits great, but now I'm starting to realize that I'd be a lot better off to go ahead and screw the face frame on before I put this back on, because I need to be able to get at all these screw holes. So I'm going to stand the cabinet up, put some glue on the front of the box, and then I'll screw the face frame on. Then we'll put the back on. Now, this is my finished end, and what I want to do is let somewhere between a 1/16 and an 1/8 inch of wood hang out past the cabinet, and then once I've driven the screws in, I can flush trim it, and that gives me just that perfectly flush joint, and I'll be able to sand it a little bit. But if I ever tried to just get it perfectly flush right away, it never works out for me. So I learned quite a while ago, especially, let a little extra hang out and then come back and flush trim it, and that works out for me every time. Okay. Okay, now all I want to do is flush trim that side, sand it, then we'll be ready to put the back in and do our final sanding on the face frame. Okay, now we're really getting down to the fine details. I'm going to flush trim this and then do a little bit of sanding to where you get a perfect joint where it just looks like it grew that way. But one of the things I'll probably do is climb cut this a little bit on my first pass, because if I get to this point and I have some of this wood tear out, I've really got a problem. That's very hard to fix. So if I carefully go backwards a little bit for my first pass before I go forward for the final cut, that usually will almost totally eliminate anything tearing out. All right, that's not going to take very much sanding. We'll have a great joint. Since I've already got the cabinet on its back, I'm going to go ahead and finish sanding the face frame before I put the back on. Okay, now it's time to put the back on. Then we'll be ready to screw it to the wall. Now this plywood back is going to square up the cabinet, but another thing it does for me is it gives all the strength I need to support the back bottom of the cabinet. Okay, let's see how this looks on the wall. First, I'm going to screw these two cabinets together with the face frame lined up. Then once I've got that connection made, I'll actually screw the cabinet to the wall. Now, I've already put a level on top of this to make sure that the cabinet's sitting pretty good. And I did have to shim it up a little bit, but it shouldn't make any difference once we add all the trim. Okay, this cabinet's really solidly screwed to the wall. Now we're going to pretty well do the same steps to finish up the upper cabinet. Now I'm going to make the pieces to finish the upper cabinet. First, I'll rebate the edges to receive the plywood back. Now I'll drill for the adjustable shelf pins. Next, I'm going to drill holes to screw the face frame to the cabinet. Now, on the left-hand finished end, I'm going to use the micro jig to do that because I want the smallest possible hole. And that's going to be a finished end. It's always going to be open because it's open shelves. On the right-hand side, I can still turn the standard pocket hole screws to the outside because that side is going against the other cabinet. I'm getting ready to start assembling the box. Now on this upper cabinet, my stretcher rails are actually made out of solid wood, and as you can see, they've got just a little bit of a decorative edge, and that's going to be because they're always exposed. Now also, I need one at the bottom, not just at the top, because this cabinet doesn't have a bottom in it like the base cabinets do. The wooden top that you see here is really what becomes the bottom of this cabinet. So I'm going to screw this piece in, and then I'll go up to the other end, screw that top stretcher rail in, and I'll be ready to screw the face frame on and then put the plywood back in. All right, the face frame screwed in place. Now I'm going to flush trim this side too. Now I'm going to staple in the plywood back, and then we'll move on to the final step in building these cabinets, which is making the plywood top. The wooden top is actually two pieces. It's a piece of plywood and then this really nice molding attached to the edge. Now the secret to getting that molding on the plywood, making it look like one piece, is the fact that I'm going to put a whole series of pocket screw holes in the plywood, and then all those screws are going to suck that molding down tight and hold it in place with just a little bit of sanding. It's literally going to look like one piece. The first thing I need to do is take this piece of plywood over, I'm going to put it in place, and then we're going to really carefully measure the length of that piece of molding, because everything's going to have to line up just perfectly if we're going to make this look like one piece. Okay, we've got a series of pocket screw holes in the bottom side of this plywood, and this molding is clamped down to the table. Now, as long as these clamps keep the molding pressed down to the table, the screws are going to just pull it straight up and make a great joint, and I'll end up with a situation where the top of the plywood is basically flush with the top of my molding, and all I have to do is a little bit of sanding. Now, on this end, we've got some pocket screw holes because we're going to screw this piece of plywood to the other top. On this end, we've got the pocket screw holes because we're going to miter a molding around the end that returns back to the wall. So my next step is just going to be to put some glue on here and start working the piece. Now in this instance, I want to make sure I've got plenty of glue, because the glue can also serve somewhat as a filler if I've got a minor little crack. And I'm always going to be able to sand off and wipe down, sand off any excess glue that I've got. Got a little bit of a knot there that I want to tap down. Now as we're doing this, one of the things I found, you really only want to be putting the screw right where you've got a clamp, or very, very close to where you've got a clamp. Even though this piece of molding's got a little bit of a bow to it, the screws are just pulling it straight and tight. Okay, now what I'm going to do is wipe the excess glue down a little bit. If there's any place that I don't have glue popping through, I'll go ahead and wipe it into that joint, and then we're going to take the sander and sand it while that glue is still a little bit wet. Now I'm getting ready to fit this last mitered return piece on our wooden top. And I'm going to put just a little fastener in here to try and make sure we keep the joint lined up before I put any screws in. Okay, now we'll come back. Okay, now we're going to do some sanding and then we'll be ready to fit the top. I'm going to put a little bit of glue in this miter joint and shoot another pin through it. And I have some pocket hole joints in the bottom that I will drive up through, but I'm going to wait to do that until we set the other cabinet down on top of it. We've laid this out so that the other cabinet will cover most of this joint. All we're going to see, hopefully, is about the last 3 inches. But right now, I'm going to put a little glue and a nail in this joint. Okay, we've got all the pieces in place. All I'm going to do now is run a few screws through the bottom of this plywood top into the face frame pieces and into my back stretcher rail, and then we'll be ready to add our doors and our trim. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this material, don't forget to like and subscribe.